Wow. It's a little difficult to preach after that. That is, wow, powerful, powerful, powerful. Honestly, I'm always so blessed when I have the opportunity to see someone who is just like a master in their craft, just using what God has given them in such a profound and powerful way. And weren't we just blessed by Ashley this morning and the gift she's been given? So thank you, Ashley, again for that. Thank you, worship team, and all the staff here. You guys are stuck with the Australian again this morning, so I hope that's okay. I feel like a friend here now. Certainly, I've been here a number of times, and hopefully I've met many of you. If I haven't met you, just way of introduction, my name is Moerman, and I'm the lead pastor of a church named Grace Capital City in downtown DC. It's a partner church here at First Baptist, and so we're a new church plant, 6 years old, and we wouldn't exist without the support and partnership of churches like this. And so grateful to call this really a second home for me and a second family to be a part of. And so thank you, as always, for allowing me to share God's word with you this morning. I will say I've been traveling the last few weeks. The accent you hear is not South Alabama. I don't want to fool you. It's actually Southern Hemisphere. But I had the opportunity to get back to Australia with my family over the last few weeks. We just got back Tuesday night, and we hadn't been back to Australia since 2019 because of a little global pandemic you may have heard about. It's amazing. It's winter down there, which Australians complain about how cold it is. It's not cold. It's pleasant, I'll say that. But I travel. I have a 7-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I will say this: and if you have young kids or you've had young kids, and you've traveled with them, traveling internationally with a 1-year-old is the refiner's fire of God in your life, right? It will sanctify you and make you more like Jesus. It will bring every bit of selfishness and pride and frustration out in you. And we are a little bit still in this process of getting our body clocks adjusted back to America time. So if I say anything crazy, just put it down to jet lag, right? That must be what's going on. But still honored to be with you guys, and glad for the opportunity to travel, but always good to be back home as well. I was really praying about what to share with you guys this morning, and was thinking about how at our church in DC, the church that I lead, we've developed this rhythm over the last 6 years of a word for the year. And it's really quite simple. Every Sunday, the first Sunday of every year, I'll preach into a very specific word, having prayed and discerned for a few weeks or months leading up to that, a word that we're sensing God is laying on our hearts as a community, something we want to press into, something we want to unpack, something we feel like is going to give us some direction for the year. And so for the short life of our church, it's been really fun to see how some of those have been lived out. I remember early on, there was the word hunger was the word. And it was that year that we established a prayer room, kind of a monthly prayer and worship service to hunger after God and kind of cultivate that part of our spiritual life. There was another year the word was wisdom. Another year the word was testimony. There's been all these different words that have defined our church. But for 2022, the word that God laid on my heart for the year was the word generations. Generations. And specifically, what it meant for us as a church to be a people that had a vision that wasn't just for our generation, but had a generational vision. That we could see that God is writing a story, that God has a perspective that transcends generations, that He involves us in a work that is always bigger than what we can imagine or even understand. And I was sitting on that word again as I was flying back to the US and thinking about my time here this morning with you guys at First Baptist. And something I've always sensed for this church that I think lines up with that is that there is a generational mandate on this church. A generational mandate. This is an old church. It's been around a long time. You guys have ministered across generations, and there is something about the legacy and the story of this church that has built upon building, upon building, upon building, that I believe is supposed to propel you and accelerate you into the next season, but also to be an encouragement and a witness to churches like my own that are earlier in the journey. There's something about having a generational vision that I think allows us to step into that. And so I want to talk this morning about what it means to have a generational vision as a church. The reality is, we live in a world that is fixated by the instant, don't we? We live in an instant world, an instant gratification world, an immediate world, and even just the way technology keeps unfolding and social media, right? This is kind of just reinforcing this idea of what it means to receive things now. When I was back in Australia, my brother put me onto this podcast called 60 Songs That Defined the 90s. 60 songs that define the 90s. Now, I don't know what you consider your era. I think there's the year you were born, right? That's one year. Then there's the era you were a kid. But then there's the decade that you really grew up in. And I think often this is like teenage, high school years. And for me, the 90s was that time. I was a teenager in the 90s, and I kind of began to take hold of my own music. And so when my brother put me onto this, I was really interested in this podcast. And it's a really, really well done. It has a whole range of music. It has everything from Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas. You guys know that song? Don't tell me you don't rock out to that at Christmas time. Come on, you know you do. Every Christmas is just royalty bank time for Mariah Carey every year, no matter what, right? So it has that. It has a whole cross of genres, different rap artists and rock artists and pop artists and all things you would have heard on the radio and MTV. When we were getting back to the States, we were on a drive just a few days ago, and I put on one of the episodes, and we decided to listen to the episode about the song I Want It That Way by the Backstreet Boys. Come on, confess. We got some Backstreet Boys fans in the house. Who knows that song, I Want It That Way, right? Okay, at least a few of you are owning up to that. Do we have any Backstreet Boys, any NSYNC fans? What's the division here? Who would consider themselves NSYNC? All right, fair enough, JT, I can get on board with that. Backstreet Boys, it was funny, that they did this whole study on what it says about a person if they're a Backstreet Boys fan or an NSYNC fan. Very fascinating. People that put up your hands, I know something about you now. I'm not going to tell you what it is. The song I Want It That Way, I'll just make this one comment. I love a good pop song. It makes no sense. The lyrics mean nothing. You say that, well, that's most pop music. Well, yeah, that's true, but even more so with this particular song. But anyway, we're listening to this podcast, and it brought me back to an era when we consumed music in a very different way, right? Does anyone remember the first album they bought? Vinyl, cassette, CD, however you got that first album. The first album I ever bought, or kind of bought, I was 8 years old, 1987. I was born in 79, so 1987. This is how it went down. My older brother came to me, and he said, hey, Chris, I've got a plan. He's 10, so he's scheming, right? And he says, there's this new band out that I've heard about. My friends told me about. They're called Bon Jovi. And I'm like, okay, tell me more. And they've just put a new record out. And if you give me your pocket money, then we can combine our money and buy this album. And if you ask, you can come to my room and listen to it sometimes. And as an 8-year-old little brother, I'm like, that actually sounds like a great deal. I'll take it. Take my money, which is probably like $1.50 or something I had, and so he bought the record, right? Because that's how we consumed music. I have fascinating conversations with my 7-year-old now about record stores, about Blockbuster video stores, and remember those, about VHS tapes, about lining up for a record release. All these things. I had a conversation with my 7-year-old the other day about how when I was growing up watching television, we had to wait for a certain time for a show to come on. was like, my favorite show was on at, 7 p.m. And if I watched it, I watched it. If I missed it, I missed it. And that was that. And he's looking at me and he said, why don't you just press the button? just press it and watch it again. I'm like, that was not where we were at in terms of technology, right? And so we have this world where we consume things really differently now. We have the instant. We can get the songs. For my son, music just exists in the stratosphere, right? It's in the metaverse, right? It's just, if you want it, you get it. If you want to watch a movie, you just press the button and there it is. We get things immediately, right? And trust me, this is not a like good old days sermon, okay? I'm not saying we go back to cassettes and CDs and vinyls or VHS tapes, or if you want to go back further, beta tapes. Remember those? But I think there's an interesting observation here, right? Because what can happen, the shadow side of the instant, is that when we become fixated, especially in our spiritual lives, we become fixated, obsessed with the immediate, we can lose a love for the ancient. And we can lose an appreciation for the ancient. I think when we get so fixated in our spiritual lives, just with the immediate, what God is doing now, what I want God to do now, I need my prayers answered now. I'm obsessed with what God is doing just in this moment. There's nothing wrong with that. But the shadow side of that is we begin to lose an appreciation for what God is doing over time. You see, God is a God of the immediate, but He's also a God of the story. And God has a perspective that we don't always have, right? God sees a vision that we don't always get. He sees from a lens, a wide-angle lens that is far bigger than ours. And I think sometimes in our rush for the now, we can lose an appreciation for how God moves slowly sometimes. You know, it sounds almost absurd to say it, but I think it bears repeating sometimes to remember that God is very old. He's seen some things. I'm kind of glad God didn't just pop up in the last 20 years, right? He's seen some things. He's been around a while. And He has a vision of our lives and of our world and of all of creation that we don't always have. There's a verse or story, a little vision actually in Daniel chapter 7. If you have a Bible, you may want to turn there. I'd love to read a couple of verses. Reed, I'm going to need you to do it again. I forgot my water in the first service and make it 2 for 2. Give it up for Reed, everybody. Come on, what a good guy. I love this man. Daniel 7, verse 9, this is a vision that Daniel is having, throne room vision. I want to read a few verses here. It says, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of life was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. I'll skip down to verse 13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And he was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. And his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So this is an interpretation of Daniel's vision of the throne room. And it's almost this fascinating look into the Godhead, right? This interaction between God the Father and God the Son, which is all a mystery. The divine dance of the triune God, right? But what's interesting most to me in this little vision is this term that Daniel uses, and he uses it twice just in those verses. He uses it again about 10 verses later. I believe it's used again in the book of Revelation, but he describes God as the Ancient of Days. He says God is the Ancient of Days. God is the Ancient One. So much we learn about God by the names of God, isn't there? When we hear that name, the Ancient of Days, God is the Ancient of Days. It's like God is reminding us, I have always been. And I will always be. And I am before time. And I am beyond time. I am the Ancient One. I am the Ancient of Days. And because I am the Ancient of Days, I have a perspective that you don't always have. Because you're a mist. That's what the Bible tells us. You're a vapor. But I'm the Ancient One. And I can see things in a way that you never can. It's this beautiful reminder of God's vision, right? I see things in a way that you can't necessarily, but I want to help you see it, right? I want to lift your eyes a little bit. And we begin to read these verses throughout the Old Testament where it's like, you ever seen a movie or maybe you've seen an experience where someone's looking down and someone comes along and just lifts their chin. It's like a hand under the chin, right? I feel like God does that to Israel all the time. It's like, I want to help you see a bit more. And there's these verses that start to give vision to what God wants to see and what God is seeing, wants to help them see, right? Psalm 105 says he remembers his covenant for 1,000 generations. Psalm 78, tell the coming generations of the glorious deeds of the Lord. Psalm 102, let this be recorded for all generations to come. Psalm 71, I will declare your power to the next generation. Deuteronomy 7, he keeps his love for 1,000 generations. When we read these verses, I want you to visualize God coming alongside Israel and coming alongside us and just lifting our chin a little bit and saying, hey, I know you're fixated on the immediate. I know you're really concerned about what's going on right now, and that's okay, that's good, that's proper, but I want to give you a vision. I want to help you see that I'm writing a bigger story than just what you're experiencing right now. I'm writing a bigger story than just your life or the life after you. It's a grand story. It's a beautiful story, and it's a story that you can't always see. I have a generational vision, and I want to start to give you the opportunity to see the world and to see your life in a generational vision also. See, the reality is God is always moving both in a generation, and He's also moving through a generation. Let me say that one more time. If you're a note taker, write that down. God is moving both in a generation, and God is moving through a generation. What I mean by that is this, right? God is moving in a generation, right? There is a move of God. There are things God is doing that are actualized and realized in our lifetime, right? I mean, you think about some of the revivals, some of the moments where God has moved in power, maybe a testimony of salvation, a baptism, a healing, something God is doing in our generation, in the generation before us, in the one before that, right? There is God movement in a generation. But here's the thing about those moments we need to recognize. What God is doing in a moment is never just about that moment. You see, God is writing a story of moments. And the moments that we experience in our generation are meant to be a catalyst and a continuation of the greater story, because God isn't just moving in our generation, He's moving through our generation, through the next generation. Does that make sense? He's moving in and He's moving through the generations. This is why we read this language in the Old Testament. I think that's so profound. Psalm 105, right? Remember His covenant. God remembers His covenant for 1,000 generations. 1,000 generations. I mean, you could read that and you could say, not 1,001? And miss the point completely. God's not up in heaven going 998, 999, 1,000, and I'm done. This is God lifting the eyes of Israel and saying, I am the Ancient of Days. I am moving through the generations. And what I'm doing in your life is not just for you, and it's not even just for your children, and it's not even just for your grandchildren. I'm writing a story that goes through them, and it's 1,000 generations, but it could be 1,000,000 generations, right? He is writing a grand story, and He is lifting our eyes to catch a bigger vision. Church, I want to challenge you tonight. We need to keep getting a bigger vision for what God is doing. We need to keep asking God for a bigger perspective to see the way the things we do in our generation matter through our generation. Because the reality is, if what we do as a church, and I'm not just talking about First Baptist, I'm not just talking about my church, Grace Capital City, I'm talking Big C, global church. If what we do in here is just an end to itself, then it doesn't actually matter that much. The songs we sing, the time we give, the people who are discipling your kids down in the nursery right now, the musicians leading worship, the missionaries out on the field, all of that, right? If it's just an end to itself, it doesn't actually matter that much. But if what we do here is part of a story that God is writing, a story that transcends our lives, and ultimately gives meaning and purpose to our lives, then you know what? All of it matters. Everything matters. Your worship matters. Your prayer matters. Your giving matters. Your service matters. The way you love your neighbor matters. It matters in the generation, but it matters through the generation, because it is the movement that God is transcending through us. God has a vision, the Ancient of Days, a generational vision to move now and to use the moments of now to continue the story that He is writing. And He invites the followers of Jesus to be a part of that story. You know, there's an illustration, a sermon illustration you might have heard before. It's pretty common. It's called the dash. The dash. And the illustration is based on this idea that if you go to a cemetery, walk around a cemetery, you're going to see a whole lot of gravestones. And the gravestones are going to have two numbers on them, right? They're going to have a birth year, and then they're going to have a death year, and then they're going to have a dash in between. And of course, the illustration is, what do you do with your dash? How do you live with your dash? How do you steward your dash? How do you make the most of your dash, right? The sum total of your life is wrapped up in that dash. Dreams, failures, challenges, victories, hopes, all of that, right? It's all in the dash. And the takeaway, what did you do with your dash? Which, on one level, you're like, man, that's a lot of pressure. I don't know when my dash is going to run out. I better make sure I use it well. Better get off Netflix. Better stop scrolling through Instagram. Got to make sure I'm using my dash. Right? Got to make sure I'm stewarding well my dash. And on one level, I've heard that sermon illustration a number of different times at youth camps or conferences or church services. On one level, I actually really agree with it. We are stewards of our lives. I think this is a really important thing to realize. We have finite years. What are you going to do with your life? But I would say this as well. The older I get, the more I believe and convinced that is actually a really narrow way to view our lives. I think it's a really narrow way to view our lives. And here's why I think it's a narrow way to view our lives. Because the reality is your life is not an isolated blip on a cosmic radar somewhere. I think the way we're invited into the kingdom reminds us that we are not just a series of isolated little dashes. Where as long as I steward my dash and you take care of your dash, and we're all just a big room full of dashes that have no connection to one another, right? As long as we take care of our dashes, then everything is fine. I don't think that's the story that the Bible actually tells us. I don't think that's the narrative of the scriptures, right? I think there's a better illustration. If we're going to have a generational vision, I think we can find a better illustration than that. And so I want to offer you a different one this morning that I personally think is more helpful than the dash. And I want you to imagine for a minute that there is a string, a long string in this room. And it's weaving its way through the pews. It starts somewhere over here and it comes around and it makes its way to the next pew, across the walkways, the aisles, and then back around. And then it gets all the way to the back, and then it goes up to the balcony, and it's weaving its way even to the people in the cheap seats. Hi, guys. It's weaving its way through the pews there, but it's one long, unbroken piece of string. And as you sit in your pew, at some point, that piece of string comes in front of you. Now, and you hold the piece of string. Now, I want you to imagine for a minute that piece of string represents God's work on the earth, God's plan, God's purposes. It represents the cross, the resurrection, the ascension, the day of Pentecost. It represents everything God is doing, the birthing of the church, the second coming of Jesus. Everything God has done, will do, is doing is represented in this piece of string. From the beginning to an end. We're not a people of circular karma. We are a people of a beginning and an in the beginning, and there will be an end, and all things will culminate in the Alpha and the Omega, right? So the string will end, but it's a long string. And as it passes you, and you sit in the pew, that represents your years on the earth. However many years God graces you with. And as the string passes you, you hold the string. And you steward the string. And you grip it. You don't want to drop it, right? And you begin to realize some things about holding the string. You begin to realize that how I hold it matters, right? That the string is longer than me. In fact, it's way longer than just me, but it's in front of me at one stage for one generation. And that how I grip the string, how I hold the string, it doesn't make or break the string, but it matters, doesn't it? And the string is connected to everyone else that's holding the string. And so if I were sitting here and I were to stand up and I'm holding the string, all of a sudden I yanked the string, right? That's not going to break the whole thing, but it could impact the person next to me. It could impact the person on my left or to my right, right? It could change the trajectory a little bit. It could have an impact. How I steward my piece of the string matters. How you steward, how we steward our piece of God's story matters. Friends, I want to remind us this morning, your life is not a dash. Your life is a part of a story. Your life is a part of a story, and the story is eternal, and it transcends generations, right? It's way bigger than just one generation, right? God is not a God of isolated dashes. God is a God of one big redemptive story that He is writing through the generations. And guys, if we are ever going to see what God is doing through our generation, we need to be faithful with what He is doing, but not fixated that we begin to lose a perspective for the bigger story that He is writing. Because right now, you and I are holding the string. It's a long string, but we don't hold it for a long time. 50 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years if you're lucky. We steward it just for a short time. And when you think back through this church, this is a church with a history. It is a church with a story. There were people before you who were holding the string. And even before this church existed, there were people that were holding the string. And how they held the string mattered, because it impacted the person and the generation that was to come. And it honored the generation that had been. Friends, you and I are the holders of the string. And if we become so obsessed with the immediate and the instant, then we will lose the bigger perspective of the story the Ancient of Days is writing. We will begin to believe that our lives and our service are just an end to themselves, that I show up to church and it's just an hour and 15 on a Sunday, and we will lose the grand story that God is inviting us into, that all of it builds into the coming and establishment of God's kingdom here on earth. If that is what He is doing, that is the string that we get to hold and we get to steward. And what God is doing in our generation is a moment, is a catalyst for ultimately what God is doing through our generation. Hold your string. Steward your string. Sacrifice for your string. Give for your string. Pray for your string. Believe that God will do things in your life that you will not see the culmination of. That you will pray prayers and sow seed that you will not see the harvest of. That you will pour your efforts into things that future generations will reap the bounty of. And that's a good thing. There's an ancient Greek proverb you might have heard before. It says, a society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they will never sit in. I love that. Can I say that about a church? A church grows great when old men and women and young men and women plant trees whose shade they will never sit in. But we steward the string. I was reminded in my time in Australia of a story from my childhood. My parents in the mid-'80s, early 80s, I guess, they were raising three boys. I'm the middle of three boys in the suburbs of Adelaide, Australia, bottom of the world. And in their area, they were starting to think through, well, what does education look like for our boys? You know, my oldest brother was just getting close to school age, and they were looking around the options, and they had explored the public school at that stage. There weren't any good public schools they felt comfortable with, not against public school at all, but there just wasn't good options in that area. And they really had a vision for a Christ-centered education. That's really what they wanted. They had a desire for it, a burning for it. Wouldn't that be good if this existed? But it didn't exist. And so they got alongside, there were two other couples at their church they started just meeting with and dreaming with and praying with. And they would have kind of informal gatherings just to talk about it. None of them had ever started a school. My mother was a elementary music school teacher at that stage, which sure, it's in the education field, but it's a long way from being someone who started a school, right? Not a principal. There's not some instructional book on this is the step-by-step play to starting a school. But they began to believe that God was laying on their heart that this desire was for a reason, for a Christ-centered school in their area. And so they dreamed about it, they prayed about it. Started with just 3 couples. Some other people began to join, and as they went through the journey, and I'll spare you all the details, about a year later, a piece of land became available. And it was a multi-acre block that existed in an area of the city at that stage that was not yet developed, but was soon to be developed. You had that sense about it, right? People were going to be moving in, and so they believed that there were going to be a lot of families, maybe in the next 20, 30, 40 years, that would be in that area. That it wouldn't be long, right? Multi-acre block, and the price tag on that multi-acre block was $80,000. $80,000. Now, we know in DC in 2022, you can't buy a front porch for $80,000, right? I mean, $80,000 doesn't get you very far these days, but in the early to mid 80s in Adelaide, Australia, that seemed like an impossible mountain for them. And they started just asking the question, all right, we can see it, we can believe it, we can dream for it. $80,000. How is this possible? And so they just did what churches and ministries have done all throughout the generations. They began to put one foot in front of another, and people gave, and people sacrificed, and they put the loaves and fish, and God multiplied it. And by God's grace, they bought that piece of land. And I want to show you a picture. This is a picture from the opening day of school. Just leave it up there. I'm the kid with his hands on his knees on the right and a full head of hair. I should have appreciated it more in that day. But that was the opening day of Torrens Valley Christian School, which was actually my first day of school as well. It just kind of coincided that the day they opened the property was the day that I started kindergarten. And what I love about that picture, I love a lot of things. It's my cousin Adam in the middle. It's his little sister who wasn't starting school yet, but was there for the picture as well. In the back left-hand corner, you can't really make it out, but that is a log cabin. It's now an old log cabin. In fact, it's been demolished since then, but it was a log cabin. One log cabin that they built with a bathroom attached to it. The patch of gravel and stone there is an unfinished playground that you can see a workman diligently trying to put somewhere for the kids to play, a swing set and a cubby house for all of us new 5-year-olds to come in and climb on. And it was a paddock with thistles and weeds, no shade. It baked in the Australian sun. I mean, it was hot. If you fast forward 40 years, I was there just a couple of weeks ago, and the last time I was in Australia, I actually spoke at the senior year graduation ceremony. It is now a fully developed campus, gymnasium, state-of-the-art facilities. They rolled out the years as I grew. So I was in kindergarten. They only had a kindergarten, first grade, kindergarten and first grade, and so on, right on through grade 12. We were the guinea pig senior year students. And now it has a full campus. I mean, who knows what it's worth these days, millions of dollars. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of students have gone through that school and have received the kind of education that my parents and 2 other couples dreamed about. Because they believed that what God would do in their generation for their kids was meant to see what God was going to do through their generation for someone else's kids. And someone else's. And someone else's. Because the story is bigger, right? The story is bigger. Guys, the size of your impact will be determined by the size of your vision. That's just the reality. If we only ever have a vision for you, for your life, for your family, for the little thing that I'm in right now, if that's all we can ever see and we miss the biggest story, then that's all we'll sow into, and we'll miss the fact that everything we do now, when we do it unto God, God intends that it would ripple through the generations and that it would impact those that are to come, just like those in this church have done for you. And we stand on the shoulders of men and women who have done just that. So we do unto those who are to come. 1,000 generations, 10,000 generations, until Jesus comes again and all things are fully redeemed in Jesus' name. That is the invitation of the Ancient of Days. And it fills our moments with meaning if we let it. It fills our songs with meaning if we let it. It fills our prayers with meaning, our giving, our serving, everything we do with meaning if we let it, to give ourselves to a bigger story. I'll finish with this as an example in my own life that we're living out right now of a generational vision. But as I said before, when we were praying about a word for the year 2022, one of the things God laid on our heart around that word generations is that our church would move from a season where we were in a rented facility to have the opportunity to actually purchase our own house of worship, our own home. And we started taking steps to that. We even found a building that we felt like, man, I feel like God's in this. We could show that picture maybe. There's a picture of this church. It's called Grace Reformed Church. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., it's on 15th Street in between Logan Circle and DuPont Circle. It actually was the home of President Teddy Roosevelt during his presidency. It's his spiritual home. So if you're a Roosevelt fan, there's some fun history there as well. Just less than a mile from where we currently worship. But we started taking these steps as a young church of like, how are we going to do this? And going through everything churches have done before, fundraising and planning and dreaming and negotiating and still working out, God, are you going to open this door for us? And alongside that come the questions. Why buy a building? Why not just rent? Why not just meet under a tree? It is a lot cheaper to meet under a tree. The church is more than a building, and trust me, I can do the ecclesiological arguments with you. I understand the church is not this building. It is not any building. The church is the people of God gathered around the presence, the word, the power of God, the mission of God, all of those things, right? Churches do not need buildings. Churches meet all over, in all sorts of places, all around the world. But as we prayed about it and pressed in, we started to recognize and remember that the city needs houses of worship. And the suburbs need them too, right? And that's why we're grateful for the witness, the faithful witness of churches like this. But the city needs them. And there are churches moving out of the city all the time. These kind of churches are being shut up, turned into apartments, turned into condos and restaurants. But the city needs houses of worship. And the city needs them not just for 20 years or 40 years, they need them for 100 years and 200 years. We need to believe that there are people that are going to keep coming into the city looking for a house where the Bible is preached, where they can find meaning for their lives and purpose. Lonely, broken people that are wandering, maybe they're just looking for a connection. Those people are coming in, and you can argue all day long like, yeah, church can meet under a tree. Absolutely it can, but there's something about the physical manifestation of a church that ministers to a city. Because when you drive by, and people drive by, they can say the people of God meet here. And I may not even be in a place where I want to meet with them right now, but one day I may be. Or my children may be. Or their children may be. And I say that all just to say that we began, as our little church, 6 years old, dreaming about buying our own building, we began to realize that this is a generational vision. It's a generational vision. It's not about buying some luxurious excess building to make us all comfortable right now. It is about establishing the faithful presence of God and the physical reality of that whatever happens in society, whatever happens in culture, whatever happens in the world, the people of God are here and can minister to this place. And in the same way that God is writing our story, I believe He's inviting all of us into that. Because we're holding the string. We're the stewards for now. The stewards of this church in the past have come and gone, and today we hold the string and we ask God, how do we serve today? Give us a vision. Just keep asking the Holy Spirit, help me see the bigger story. Help me see the bigger vision. Help me have a perspective to know that everything I'm doing now can be used for your glory and for the coming of your kingdom here on earth. I wonder if we could just do this for a minute, if you don't mind. Just close your eyes and just hold your hands out like this. And I want you to even, just for a moment, as I close up, just almost imagine the physical feeling of that string in your hands right now. And let that feeling be a reminder of what God has given you. The talents, the passions, the interests, the things He's put in your hand, and then this beautiful mandate that right now we hold the string. That we may be good stewards. That we may be courageous when it's time to be courageous. That we may be faithful when it's time to be faithful. That we may have vision for our lives that transcends our lives. Hold the string. And I wonder if we could do this in Numbers chapter 6. There's a passage you're probably familiar with. It's a generational blessing. And I know at our church when we have baby dedications, we sing it over the children. But it's those verses that say, the Lord bless you. The Lord keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you. Be gracious to you. The Lord turn His countenance towards you and give you peace. I wonder if we could even just sing that generational blessing. There's a song that you might have heard. It goes, "The Lord bless you and keep you. Make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face towards you and give you peace." Let's sing it again. Sing it over the generations to come as we hold the string. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn His face towards you and give you peace. God's people said, Amen.